I draw a parallel between using a Ouija board, asking whoever's there to respond, is rather like living in a city with a notice on the front door, everybody welcome, anybody welcome. Sooner or later somebody will come in and will do damage.
One thing I found from doing Ouija boards before, that it doesn't answer anything unless you ask the question, so you have to be very thorough and make sure you've asked everything you need to ask. It wouldn't necessarily then go on and tell you what he did, where he lived. You'd actually have to ask the question, so it's quite easy to miss things out. So the next question we asked was, how long had he been dead? And in a process of actually spelling out letter for letter, it said 150 years.
Watford is an old market town that lies a few miles to the northwest of London. It's a town that goes back a long way. St Mary's Church, for example, dates from the middle of the 13th century. Today it's a typical crowded, busy suburban centre with lots going on. Our story comes from a part of the town where the old and the new come together. The ancient church, a row of old Georgian houses, and a bustling modern shopping centre. In one of the shops, which is used as a studio, some of the staff began to notice some strange things going on. Nothing particularly frightening or alarming, but disturbing and nervous-making, mainly because they kept happening, and they couldn't be explained in any rational way.
The staff were very edgy, and they sort of walked around in twos, and they were saying all these little stories about things that go bump in the night, and I thought someone was trying to wind me up. I'd heard little things, so I didn't really think much was going on, because I hadn't seen visual proof of what's happening. It started pretty weird. The camera would sort of turn itself on and turn itself off, lights would go on and off, and I really thought there was somebody in the studio who was doing it to wind up everybody else.
There was a lot of talk about the atmosphere within. There'd been lots of things happening, pictures flying off the wall. Nobody liked to be in the studio on their own, you know, after hours, because it was such a frightening atmosphere. So they tended to all kind of scoot off together at the end of a day. They were scared. The people were scared in there, yeah.
Well, what would happen is we would lock up the studio at the end of the night. On the wall of the studio there were a series of portraits, because by the nature of the business we had lots of families and lots of groups of children in to be photographed. So what we would do is take a whole variety of shots, and then on the wall those would be reproduced as a series of portraits. So we'd have things like mum and dad, a family picture and two children picture, all from the same family, up on the wall. What would happen is we'd leave the studio, lock up and go, and we'd arrive in the morning and find that maybe the mother's portrait would be substituted or switched with a mother from another group, or we'd generally come in and find that the items in the particular groups have moved around.
The camera's actually set up onto a computer system, so it'll tell us when the film is finished, when the supply film has run out, how many exposures we've got left on the tape, how full the camera is really. And it would say, oh, 2 exposures left, when I know there's a brand new film in the camera. So you'd have to stop and change the film, and then you do like a family sitting, normally about 7 or 8 photographs, and then it would tell you the film was empty, so you'd have to change it again. And after about the 3rd go, just got fed up of it. So you just have to reset the camera and sort of carry on going. But in the middle of sittings, you'll turn around and say, oh, hang on a minute, folks, I've just got to change the film. And it's like, oh, it gets frustrating.
Eventually, because these happenings seemed to be increasing, 3 or 4 people decided to hold a Ouija board session. It was all very light-hearted and inconsequential, more curiosity than anything else. But they wondered if they could learn something about what was causing the disturbances. The Ouija board is a very old device. The ancient Egyptians used them to contact dead spirits. More recently, in Victorian times, they became immensely fashionable across Europe and America. All kinds of prominent people in society took part in Ouija board sessions. Today, it's become something of a party game. But there are many people who would claim to have had some kind of unexplained experience as a result of using them.
We set the Ouija board up, and within a few moments the glass was flying across the board. About 10 o'clock that evening I decided to go home. I got in my car and I looked in the rearview mirror. There was an old lady sitting on the back seat. Very clear enough for me to describe her. When I turned around, she disappeared. I didn't think a great deal more of it until the following week when we did the Ouija board again, but this time I asked the Ouija board who it was in the back of my car. The board and the glass very clearly spelt out the name BEA. It then went on to say that this was my great-grandmother and she was in the back of the car with me all the time. Well, I don't know the name of my great-grandmother, so I then, the following day, called my grandmother and asked her the name of my great-grandparents. She told me that her mother's name was Beatrice and that she was always known as B. This was kind of nice because it was the feeling that it was all true, that there was really something to it, that it couldn't have just been made up by the girls or something. The following week we did the Ouija board again, and I got in the car about 10 o'clock, looked in my rearview mirror, and there she was again, just as clear as the time before. A short while later, I was just approaching my home, and a very good friend of mine lived on the left-hand side of some traffic lights where I pulled up. I hooted, he came to the window, and he waved. He went away, he came back again within a few seconds, and seemed to inspect the car a little more closely, waved, and went away again. And I went home. I thought no more of it until the following morning, when he phoned me and asked me who was sitting in the back of my car. When I asked him why did he ask that, he said, well, did you not see me return to the window? Because I knew you must have been on your way home, therefore why would there be somebody sitting in the back of the car? But whoever it was waving at me.
But for all its apparent casualness, those in the know about these things, particularly psychic mediums and parapsychologists, who spend a great deal of time dealing with the after effects of psychic events, constantly warn against the potential dangers of dabbling in the paranormal in this or indeed any other way. It can, they argue, have all kinds of unexplained and unwanted results.
We find often when people have been to fortune tellers or astrologers or dabbled with the Ouija boards or tarot cards, that often what happens, the information to begin with is very good and interesting and factual. They actually find that the information that's passed is accurate. So after a while they begin to trust the source of this information, and then suddenly it seems to change tack and begins to feed them inaccurate stuff, sometimes absolute lies, sometimes threatening them with death or with very serious accidents, sometimes throwing doubt on other previously trustworthy relationships. You know, one case, a brother, two brothers and the wife of one of them played the Ouija board, and it gave them a lot of information which was accurate. And suddenly one day it said, your brother is having an affair with your wife. And they were all stunned by this. And luckily, the husband knew there was no chance of this happening. And they took the board out of the house and burnt it immediately.
The assumption behind this kind of warning, and clearly supported by the experience of people like Tom Willis, would seem to be that there are spirits or entities or whatever involved in some kind of parallel existence. And if a channel of communication is opened up, they will make their presence felt.
The trouble with using Ouija boards as a means of satisfying curiosity, which young people often do, is that they go into it unprotected. And I draw a parallel between using a Ouija board, asking whoever's there to respond, is rather like living in a city with a notice on the front door, everybody welcome, anybody welcome. Sooner or later somebody will come in and do damage. And there are plenty of spirits of a fairly lowly sort who are plain mischievous, who are able to mimic and pretend that they are much better souls than they really are, until they get you trapped in following their silly instructions. And by that time they've established such a rapport with you, or you with them, that you can't let go of them, they can't let go of you and won't let go of you, and they can make your life a misery.
I was always fascinated by the experience of an American editor who began playing around with an Ouija board until he found, to his dismay, that one of these damn spirits had got inside his head and was permanently talking. He said it was the spirit of a Nantucket sea captain who seemed to be envious of the fact that he was alive and the Nantucket sea captain was dead. Well, he said some friend of his who knew about these things got him to go along, did something or other which is not described. He had to write with his hand. Something took him over, and his hand wrote, "Each of us has a spirit while alive. Do not mess about with the spirits of the dead." And he says, as this happened, he suddenly felt the spirit being pushed out through the top of his head. And he said, as it seemed to pop out of the top of his head like a cork, he felt incredible relief, as you can imagine. And in that moment, he said he could have told you anything about the future.
In Watford, no one, it seems, had any fears about setting up the Ouija board session, although it's noteworthy that no one has wanted to repeat it since, and no one had any particular expectations. When they described it later on, much of what emerged seems to have been pure gobbledygook. But to their complete astonishment, they did seem to get some coherent information about a particular individual, a former schoolteacher, a name, where he lived, how he died, and when.
The first question we asked was who was haunting the studio, and it came up with the name of Keith Cook. So the next question we asked was how long had he been dead? And in a process of actually spelling out letter for letter, it said 150 years. And we found out then that he taught at the free school. The next question we asked was why he was haunting the studio. And again, the glass moved with our fingers and spelt out, letter by letter, he wanted to be near the children. We asked him why he wanted to be near the children, and his answer to that was that he had been involved in a fire when he worked at the school. And several of the children had perished in the fire, and he had actually lost his own life by going back in to save the kids. We were told by Keith Cook that he was a middle-aged man, and he had died during his middle age. He also mentioned that in addition to working at the school, he had also worked at the workhouse, which was situated adjacently, and he actually resided at the workhouse. Apparently, this was quite a common thing, and people who taught in one often taught in the other.
It seems inconceivable that any of this information could have been in the heads of the people who took part in this session. None of it meant very much to them at the time. Indeed, none of them did anything about it. But it raised the most fundamental question. Did any of this extraordinary detail check out in the historical records? Nobody who attended the Ouija board session in Watford had any intention of following up the information they seemed to have gained from it. If anything, the strange, unexplained activity at the studio increased.
Almost directly after finishing the Ouija board, for the few days after, and then the weeks after that, the disturbances started to get more and more severe. We thought probably at the beginning that it had been because we knew a bit more about what had been going on, and maybe we'd just become slightly more sensitive to the atmosphere that was obviously building up in the place.
Things got pretty hairy then. It sort of happened so there was more frequency to when the events were happening. There was the backgrounds would still be changing around, things would still be moving, and you'd say, "Oh, shut up, George," and half an hour wasn't long enough. He'd be back in 10 minutes doing something else. So I think he was really trying to get somebody's attention, but there was nobody around who could really talk to him and find out what was going on or why he was still around.
It was a very cold atmosphere. It felt almost dark, like something was kind of surrounding you. It was that heavy. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was almost like you were being watched and covered. It's hard to explain. A very heavy presence.
But the story tugged away at Ian's curiosity. There seemed to be so much detail. Could it be possible that Keith Cook, schoolmaster, had existed? But where to begin the search? Watford is a big place, with dozens of old schools. But then one day, over a year later, passing a converted office just round the corner, he happened to glance up, and his eye was drawn to a plaque on the wall. It contained the words, "Free School." Something clicked in his brain. That was how it had come out at the session. It launched Ian on a search that became an obsession. The school, he learned, had been founded as a bequest in 1709.
There's an office building which is actually inside the old free school building, And on the outside of the free school, there's a plaque which makes reference to the history of the building. There is quite a bit of information written about the school. It had been the first school in the Hertfordshire area for the education of young children who couldn't afford to be educated privately. The lady who actually started the school and arranged for the building had set aside an amount of money in her will to ensure the school had always remained as a school building.
But there was nothing in all that long history that mentioned a master called Keith Cook. Although when we looked into it, there has been a continuous record of minor paranormal activity at the school.
Myself personally, in the 10 years that I've worked for there's been a couple of times when I felt extremely uncomfortable, but you know, you sort of hear the things about ghosts and you think, oh no, you're being silly. But there was one occasion, and it was during the day. It wasn't one of the late evenings that sometimes I work on my own. It was actually during a Saturday afternoon. On the ground floor, I went through and I was working quite happily, and I went to go up the stairs. And I felt sort of buzzing around my ear, and I thought maybe I had a wasp in my hair. And I started brushing my hair and realised that it wasn't that time of the year. And sort of all of a sudden there was this coldness around me, and I don't quite know what it was. I can't explain it, but all I knew is that Saturday afternoon I had to get out of that building, so I did no more than set the alarm and go very, very quickly.
So where to turn to pick up the thread of Keith Cook? Right next to the schoolhouse, there was a row of almshouses, or houses built for the poor, that have been there since 1721. Could they possibly have been related to the workhouse, where the spirit or entity had described himself as living 150 years ago? As it happens, the very first national census in this country was carried out just over 150 years ago, in 1841. Ian set out to check the census records for Watford for that date, a task that proved much easier to say than to do. It was very difficult indeed to locate the right piece of microfiche. But when it came, the result proved to be astounding.
And I went to the Watford Library and looked through the rolls of microfilm they keep there for the census. And the first census they hold there is for 1841. After several hours, 2 or 3 hours of looking through, and with assistance from the librarians, we found a listing for the Watford Workhouse, and a master was listed there by the name of Keith Cook.
The fact of the 1841 census was an extraordinary coincidence. It proved beyond the shadow of doubt the reality of the information that had been revealed at the Ouija board session. There had been a Keith Cook. He was a schoolmaster. He had lived in the workhouses 150 odd years ago. When Ian checked the records for 1851, Keith Cook was no longer there. So how had he died? Where was the fire? When he went back to the school records, they showed that there was a strange gap in its activities between 1841 and 1842, almost as if it had closed down, but no reason was given. Then Ian discovered that it had in fact been rebuilt in 1842. Why would a school need to be rebuilt? Could this have been the fire that the spirit or the entity had referred to? The Watford fire records didn't go back beyond 1868, so they didn't help. But it looked as if, by some strange quirk of fate, Keith Cook had lived just long enough to be captured by the 1841 census, and then had died in a fire at the school just a few months later, trying to save the children.
I established the building had been rebuilt in 1842 because there's a reference to it in a reference book that's held in the Watford Library that says in 1842 the free school was built. All references prior to that were during the 1700s, which would obviously have been the previous school. I can find no other explanation as to why the school would have been rebuilt with no detailed records kept other than there was a fire. When we finally found out Keith Cook had indeed existed, I was amazed. After a period of several hours sitting in the library, it was amazing to find out that that person had existed. Until then, it was probably a period of 2 or 3 years when we had known the name, but until I actually looked into the background of the story and found him, it was an amazing feeling to know that he existed. And gradually, other areas of the story began to slot into place.
The story of Keith Cook, Victorian schoolmaster, is undoubtedly an extraordinary one. From the sheer difficulty we experienced, in putting together the details of this man's life, it's quite clear that none of the people who attended that single casual session in Watford could have had prior knowledge of his existence. The information that came across was quite remarkable in its detail. The name, the age, where he lived, how he died, even the kind of school he taught at. The fundamental question, of course, is where did it come from? How is it possible that a man who died 150 years ago was able to communicate information about himself to a modern audience? It's a question that lies way beyond the bounds of conventional science. Like so many other stories in this series, it raises the most profound questions about what happens to the human mind after death.
Sometimes I think the death is so sudden, occasionally some soul refuses to believe it's dead and is invisible and nobody's taking any notice of it, and it's in a permanent nightmare and is trying to say to people, look, I'm here, I'm here. Do objects fly about like that? You know, and tries first of all to say, look, I am here. Do you realize you're not alone? Now you realize something's here. Now I'll try and let you know who I am.
One of the many puzzling things is that the capacity of these entities to transmit information, if only in order to prove who they are and that they have survived, varies enormously. In some cases it can be extraordinarily detailed, very specific in such a way as to provide veridical evidence, i.e. evidence which is not known to or apparent to any of the people on this side, not at any rate until sometime later the evidence is checked and found to be accurate. That's the sort of thing for which there is a great deal of actual evidence which doesn't admit of any denying.
To make sense of it, we have to step outside the materialist, reductionist idea of what a human being is. A very complicated electrochemical, physical mechanism with the mind and the personality seated in the brain's operations, and that when the brain dies and is destroyed, then that is the end of it. If those cases of apparitions, of information given that was not in any person, any living person's mind, are authentic, then it would appear that there is a part of a human being that can operate independent of time and space. I'm sure of that, and may even be able to operate independent of mortality.